CCSU in Old Town, Maine on the Penobscot Indian Reservation, and Charles himself is a Penobscot Indian. Okay. Charles served in World War II with the 1st Division of the United States Army. I believe it was the 16th Regiment.
16th Infantry Regiment.
16th Infantry Regiment, and it was Fox Company.
Fox Company, Combat Medic.
Fox Company, Combat Medic. And his rank at the time was what, Charles?
PFC.
PFC, Private First Class. And, all right, we're now going to begin the interview proper. Charles, you were drafted, is that correct?
I was drafted, yes.
Okay. Can you tell me, you were living at the time in Old Town, is that correct?
When I registered for the draft, I was living in Old Town.
Okay.
And before I was drafted, I attended a machinist school in Dexter, Maine. And I got my certificate in November of 1942. And when I came back home, my parents had already moved to Boston to work in the Boston Navy Yard. Mm-hmm. And I went to Boston, and I had to notify the draft board that I was now resident of Boston, and I was drafted in the quota of Massachusetts.
Okay. Do you remember what month and year you were drafted then?
I was drafted in April of 1943.
Okay. Okay. When you were drafted, you were given a choice of service, or were you drafted into the Army?
I was drafted into the Army.
Okay.
I had no choice.
Okay. Once you were drafted into the Army, did you have the ability to select functioning as a medic or choose to be a medic?
No, I was drafted into the military service, drafted into the Army, sent off for basic training to Camp Pickett in Virginia.
Okay.
And at the completion of during my time as taking my basic training, I was told I would be a medic.
Okay.
They lined you up and they said, you're going to be truck drivers, you're going to be medics, you're going to be infantrymen. That's the way they did it.
Okay. Well, can you remember at the time when at this point you're in Fort Pickett in Virginia, you've been told you're going to be a medic. How did you feel about that? Were you excited? Were you disappointed? Or did you have any thoughts about it? Or?
No, I didn't actually give it much thought. Whatever I was selected for, I just took it as part of my destiny.
Okay, well that's
and I had no choice anyway, so, and I can't say I was happy about it or disappointed. I just accepted what I was told to do.
Okay. And how long were you in Fort Pickett, Virginia?
I think at that time, I think basic training was approximately 8 or 10 weeks. I don't remember exactly, but it was not much more than that.
Okay. Can you remember your basic training experience fairly well in terms of the type of training, the instructors, your fellow trainees or inductees?
Oh yeah, I had one very well. You learned discipline. You learned how to keep your equipment and your personal belongings clean, and we have to stop. Wait for the clock. And it was just a general training to introduce you into a new type of life. Discipline was most important.
Did you like the officers and the instructors?
Oh yes, I get along very good with everybody. I always get along good. While I was taking basic training, I was convinced or introduced to a boxing team, and I participated in a couple of boxing matches until I got my nose blooded up one time, and then I stopped.
Oh, okay. Well, that was probably all part of the discipline.
That's all part of the discipline, yeah.
Okay. Did you forge any friendships during basic training that lasted till later?
No, not in basic training, because I mean, I knew men by their names, but I cannot say that I have formed any lasting friendships, no.
Okay. Where did you go after basic training?
I was sent to a surgical technician school in Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indianapolis, Indiana, for I think approximately a 10-week course. I'm not sure about that either.
Okay. During that training in Indiana, did you actually have the opportunity to work with live patients, or was it purely training?
It was only technical training. What we learned came from books, and there were no actual on-site training.
Okay. But you knew at that point that you would be a medic who would go into combat in support of the troops.
Well, I didn't know that because I was trained as a surgical technician.
Okay.
So with that training, I assumed that I was going to be perhaps working in a hospital or something, or a field hospital.
Okay.
But
So
I
you could
really
have been behind the lines.
I could have been behind the lines, yes.
Okay. So at this point, it's probably mid-1943. Would that be fair to say?
That was 1943, yes. Following my basic training and my surgical technician school, I had a short leave to go home.
Okay. So you went to Boston.
I went to Boston, and we probably can reconstruct because I said 10 weeks, that's 2.5 months. Basic training, 10 weeks, well, that's 5 months. So I went in April, and 5 months later would be September.
August, September,
Yeah,
into the
September.
summer.
I went home for a couple of days leave, and then I had to report to New York City for shipment overseas, and I traveled across the ocean on the Queen Elizabeth, which had been converted into troop transport ship.
So you went right over to England after your visit with your family in
Yes,
Boston.
yes.
And you left from New York. How long?
My mother accompanied me to New York when I went to board the ship.
Okay. Was that somewhat painful to say goodbye to your family and to go overseas, knowing you might not see them for a while?
Well, it was painful, but I was a young man, and I was looking forward to the adventure, I think. It
Okay.
didn't bother me too much.
Okay. And how long did it take to travel overseas? How long was the voyage? Approximately.
This was one of the fastest traveling ships, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary. I think the Queen Elizabeth was even a little bit faster than the Queen Mary. They had both been converted. And I think it was approximately 5 days across the ocean.
Were you
5 or 6 days at the most.
Okay. Were you protected by any ships, battleships?
No, because these ships traveled so fast that the U-boats could not zero in on them. We did not have any protection.
Okay.
They were just too fast for submarines or whatever they had.
Okay, so you then traveled to England, and where did you go once you got to England?
I had to depend on Harold to tell me that, but I've forgotten. He told me through his research. He's done very thorough research on all of my experiences from the time I went into the service until I became a POW.
Let's pause for just a moment and tell us who Harold is. Give us his full name and have what he has done with you and for you. Just take a moment.
Well, Harold Prince is a distinguished professor of anthropology at Kansas State University.
Okay.
He had been working, and he comes from the Netherlands. He took his initial education in Netherlands.
Okay.
And then he came to the state of Maine. He worked here in Bowdoin College and a couple of other colleges. He worked with the Indians, mainly with the Micmacs.
Okay.
His wife, Bunny McBride, also worked with the Indians here on the Penobscot Indian Reservation. That's how I met her.
Okay.
I was here on leave from Europe one day, and I went up to visit with my brother, and Bunny McBride was in his home because his wife spoke perfect Penobscot Indian, and she was doing some work on that research work on Indian basket making and languages and so forth.
So you met them some years
So
ago.
I met Bunny at
Okay.
my brother's house, and then later on she introduced me to her husband.
Okay. All right. So You are not entirely sure where you went when you got to England after your voyage on the Queen
No,
Elizabeth, but
Harold, as I said before, Harold Prince told me, but I have forgotten because I don't know, these things don't seem to interest me very much anymore.
well, were you in the English countryside?
I was in the English countryside, yeah. I recall that we were in a large English barracks,
Okay.
an old, very old stone brick building
Okay.
that had no central heating. They had fireplaces in them like the old medieval castles,
Okay.
and that was the way the place was heated.
Okay.
And I did not stay there very long. I was once I got to England, I stayed there maybe a week or 10 days, and it was a replacement depot.
What they call a repo depot.
A repo depot, yes. And then I was told what my assignment was going to be and where I was going.
So even then, when it was still 1943, you were told that you would be part of the invasion of mainland Europe. You weren't given specific.
No, we were not told that. No, we were told that we were going to. That in my case, I was told that I was going to be joining the 1st Infantry Division, the 16th Infantry Regiment as a medic. I would be joining the medical detachment,
Okay.
the battalion medical detachment. Once I got into the detachment, of course, I was greeted by a man. He was a staff sergeant at that time, Ray Lambert, who I still correspond with today. He's the only man that I have been able to find that is alive from that time, the two of us.
And what was his relationship? He was your superior officer, or
He was a non-commissioned officer, and he was responsible for my training and for my assignment.
okay. So now it's still 1943, but it's the fall of 1943. So take us through the next few months in England. What did you do? Did you just continue your training and go through exercises, say mock landings or any maneuvers?
Well, it slowly became evident what we were training for. We knew that it was eventually going to be a invasion of Normandy, northern France. Of course, we didn't know where, and being a private, I had no information about technical or tactical things that were going on in the division. But it was common knowledge that we were training for the eventual landing in Normandy, France.
Okay. Okay, and by the way, before I asked you, I should clarify, 1st Division, 16th Regiment, what battalion was F Company in?
I was in F Company, 2nd Battalion. The battalion consists of 3 companies. A Company, B Company, no, more. A, B, no, yeah, let's see, A, B, C, D, E, F. 3 battalions, excuse me. A regiment consists of 3 battalions, and the battalion consisted of 4 companies.
4 companies.
Yes.
Okay.
And I was assigned to F Company, so therefore that was a 2nd Battalion.
Okay, very good. Okay, so but is it true that you continued training? Did you go on any kind of maneuvers in the English
Oh yes, we were
countryside?
constantly on maneuvers.
Okay.
We were constantly training on ships, how to debark from ships into small landing craft.
Oh, okay.
How to, we made even landings on some of the beaches, during our training.
Right, on the English beaches.
Yes,
English
and
shores, right.
how to dig foxholes and how to eat out of mess kits and how to eat C rations and K rations and.
Right. I know that during the training for the D-Day landings, there was one very big mock landing on the English coast where the German E-boats, the patrol boats, actually came across the landing and shot it up badly and killed a lot of men, and they were worried that
I heard about that. They sunk one of the training ships that was full of GIs that were training, and I think there were approximately, I have heard, around 700 men lost their lives in that attack.
And I believe that incident was actually covered up for a long time and kept very private. So you've been in England for several months. Can you share with us a little bit about your experiences with English civilians or English soldiers? Did you enjoy your interaction with the English folks?
Oh yes, We were assigned living quarters in houses that people had vacated for the GI so that they could live in houses. Our dispensary was in a building on the second floor. And of course we interacted with the civilians, especially with the young girls. And
So you dated a couple of English women, I'm
well,
assuming.
not a couple. I was not a Romeo. I dated one.
All right, but that's good. So you got to interact with the English folks,
Yes.
and I'm sure that you enjoyed meeting them, and you felt like they were sort of good.
Yeah, we had. I met very nice people in England, and they were happy that we were there to participate in the invasion of Normandy.
In liberating Europe.
But one of the common saying is the English people thought the GIs had too many cigarettes, too much chewing gum, too much chocolate, too much money, and too much sex.
Okay, so there was a little bit of envy there, perhaps. Did you get a chance to go to London or the bigger cities?
No, I never went to any big cities. I stayed mostly where I was assigned.
Okay.
Because we didn't have time. We didn't have time for that. We were not permitted on leave to go to extended leaves to go to visit other cities or whatever.
Okay.
In my particular unit, anyway.
Okay. So during the build-up, as you got closer to the eventual D-Day date, did you start to learn more? Did they? My understanding was that a lot of units, as they got toward the final phase of training before the landings, that all leaves were canceled. The men were sealed in compounds so that there could be no interaction with even the British civilians because they were afraid of spies revealing information, men talking too much. Men were shown very detailed mock-ups of the beaches and the surrounding countryside. Did you have experience any of that?
Yes, we had. That's true. We had no. After a certain date, before the invasion was to take place, we were completely sealed off. We were not permitted to take any leave. We were not permitted to intermingle with anybody. Only with the people that we had direct contact with, that we worked with. We were more or less isolated, and
At that time,
that
did
was
you
part
start?
of the training.
Okay. At that time, did you start to feel a lot of anticipation, maybe a little anxiety, some excitement about just, we're finally going to move and do something? Or do you recall any of your feelings then?
Well, I was a type of a person, I didn't give much thought to things like that. As I said before, I just accepted things as they came, and I never gave it much thought. I didn't have any fear of being wounded or any fear of dying, because I just knew it was not going to happen to me for some reason.
Okay. Did you, at that point, did you know any other American Indians that were in your
Yes,
group?
I met one Native American from the Penobscot Reservation here, he was 4 years older than I was, but I knew him. I mean, we can't say we grew up together because he was 4 years older, so we didn't play together or anything like that as children. He was in the 26th Infantry Regiment, and somehow he heard that I was in the 16th Infantry Regiment, and he visited me.
And his name was?
His name was Melvin Neptune.
Okay.
And when we talked, we did not talk about any impending military action that was going to be taking place. We just talked about our friends that we left behind or that were already in the military service, where they were, what they were doing, and wondering what our parents were doing and so forth. It was very personal.
But it must have been nice to have him to...
But it was nice, yes. I looked up to him because he was already a hardened combat infantryman. He had made the invasion of North Africa, had fought through North Africa, where I think he earned the Bronze Star. He had participated in the invasion of Sicily and fought through Sicily.
Wow.
And then...
so he was truly a battle-hardened veteran at that point.
He was, yes, and I sort of looked up to him.
So he gave you some perspective on it.
He gave me a lot of courage.
Well, that's great. Okay, so now we're into June 1944, and do you remember the English city where you boarded the troop ship to cross the English Channel? Can you remember that?
Yeah, again, Harold told me. I have to I have to refer to Harold all the time. He tells me all of these things, but I don't retain them. Uh,
But can you recall actually boarding
I
the
don't.
ship?
Yeah, I recall boarding the ship, and he told me the name of the harbor where it took place, and I remembered it at the time, but since then I have forgotten it again.
Okay, and you boarded the troop ships probably on June 4th or 5th. Would that be correct? So
We
you had-
boarded the ships, I think, on 3rd, 3rd, 4th of June, something like that, because the original debarkation date for the invasion was scheduled for the 5th of June.
Correct.
And because of the heavy seas and inclement weather, it had to be postponed for 24 hours, and it was postponed until the 6th of June. But the 6th of June was not much better. It had probably been calmed down a little bit. I don't say calmed down, but the waves were not 20 feet high anymore.
So you basically were in the ship's hold for 24 to 48 hours.
Yes, exactly. Hmm.
Did you experience, that might have been at least somewhat frustrating because you're thinking you're going to go, then Eisenhower held you back, and
Yeah.
did you experience any seasickness or?
No, I did not get seasick. Of course, we had a lot of people that got seasick.
I'll bet.
And we occupied ourselves by playing cards or shooting dice. We had a little bit of money, so
Okay.
we gambled up until the last minute.
Okay. Okay, so when you knew it was a go and Eisenhower made the decision for
Yeah.
June 6th, you headed across the channel. Were you able to get on deck and see the hundreds and even the thousands of other ships around
Oh yes,
you?
we were told to prepare to don our gear, prepare to debark onto landing craft, because we had traveled across the English Channel at night. We anchored about 2:30 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, about 12 miles off the coast of Normandy, and we were told to prepare and go up on deck with all of our equipment. And well, we knew that this was it, and the seas were very rough. And when we debarked, they threw nets over the sides of the ship that we used as ladders to go down to the landing craft. And because of the rough seas, these little landing craft were bobbing up and down, and you had to time yourself just right to leave the landing net to jump into the boat, because if you timed it wrong, you could perhaps have had serious injury to your legs or something.
You could have broken your
But
legs.
everybody, the people that were already in the boat were watching the people that were getting ready to jump in, and they always gave you the signal when to jump and things like that. We helped each other then.
Oh, that's good. Now, each landing craft held, what, 24 men or so?
Each landing craft held, I think, around 25 to 30 men, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. And that included, obviously, some infantrymen. It wasn't just all medics in one craft.
No, which all infantrymen with one medic, and a dependent. Maybe the squad leader was the second lieutenant. The platoon leader was a second lieutenant. He was with us, but he may not have been in the same boat with us, because a platoon consisted of
About 50 men,
I
correct?
think about 60.
Okay.
I don't know, 50. I don't know really.
I
I've
think it
forgotten.
was 50 some odd men thereabouts.
But anyway, the platoon leader was there with us, one medic, and the rest of the people were infantry. And they had different jobs to do. They had different weapons with them. It depended on what they had been trained to do.
Okay. Did you know at that point the code name for your beach, that you were going to Omaha Beach? Did you have some sense of where you were going into specifically?
I personally did not have any knowledge, no, because, as I said before, I was a private, and I had no idea of the tactical problems that we were facing, and I was not informed because I was There was no reason for me to be informed. I was a private. I just did what I was told to do.
Okay. So you're in the boat. You probably circled and circled a bit and waited for the command to head in toward the beaches.
Yes, once the LGVPs were loaded with the 30 or 32 men, we proceeded to some distance from the ships and began circling, because it was planned that so many LCVPs would be in one landing wave.
Right.
And I think it was maybe, I have no idea about that either, but I think it was maybe about 6 landing craft had to be in formation, going in circles, and then about 5 o'clock in the morning, we received the people that were operating the boats received the order to proceed to the beach.
Okay. So as we've discussed, were you in the very first wave to go in?
I was in the very first wave, yes.
And this was approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, was that correct?
About approximately 6 o'clock, maybe a little bit after, yes, when we arrived at the debarkation point from the landing craft.
Okay. What I'd like you to do next, if you could, would be and I should say out of respect, clearly what you went into was hell. And if you feel there are any things that it's hard for you to discuss, then that's perfectly understandable. But given that, please describe what you saw around you as the boats were getting close to the beach. You must have seen a lot of enemy fire, maybe some ships being hit. But tell me what you would like to share.
Well, we proceeded to the beach, and it was impossible to get very close to the beach because the Germans had erected barriers well beyond the low tide area out into the water. And when the landing craft hit these barriers and could not move anymore, the order was immediately given to debark, because we were in immediate danger of being blown out of the water if we didn't get out of the ships, that landing craft. So when I left the landing craft, when the ramp went down, many of the men were wounded immediately, or perhaps even killed. If they were seriously wounded with the heavy equipment, and when they left the landing craft, they just sank to the bottom. There was no help for them. It was every man for himself. You did not take the time to help anybody because you were also only concerned with your own survival. And when I left the landing craft, I landed in water up to my chest. And of course your clothes and your boots and everything become immediately waterlogged. You're carrying heavy equipment, bazookas and all kinds of equipment. And it was very difficult to proceed when you're up to your waist in water, up to your chest almost. It was very difficult to make any headway. It was any headway you made was very slow. And I eventually was able to get into water that only went up to my ankles and my knees or whatever. And the first thing I did was head for one of the barriers that the Germans had erected. I don't know what they called them. Anyway, they were cross iron posts. And we used, all of the GIs used this for protection to proceed to the beach by going from one iron block from one to the next, until you were able to get to an area where you could make a dash for the beach and the embankment.
Okay. At this point, there were probably many troops already on the beach, maybe some burning landing craft and vehicles, and probably many men had already been hit. So were you telling yourself at that point to just try to help whichever men you could help once you got onto the land?
My main concern at this particular moment was to get to the beach. Survival. I was only thinking about survival. And once I got to the beach, of course, many wounded had made it, that were not seriously wounded had made it to the beach also. I began immediately treating the men that were there on the beach that had made it up to the the embankments of the seawall. And while I was doing this, I saw our captain, our company commander, Captain Finke. He was off to my right, trying to motivate the men to get up and move. And I happened to look back and I saw that the tide was coming in very fast. Of course, a half an hour or perhaps even more time must have passed because the tide doesn't come in that fast, but it seemed to me like it was coming fast because time was going by so fast.
Time was compressing and expanding. Yeah.
And I looked back and I saw that there were many wounded men that were floundering in the water and could not help themselves. And I knew that if nobody went to help them, they were doomed to die, to drown, because they were loaded with heavy equipment. They couldn't fend for themselves. They couldn't help themselves. So I proceeded, I left what I was doing on the beach and I proceeded back into the water. And I proceeded to get as many men as I could out of the water by turning them over on their backs and grabbing under their shoulders. I don't know where my strength came from. But they say that once the adrenaline starts flowing in your body, you can do...
You can lift cars.
Yeah, you can do unbelievable feats. So I guess that's what happened to me.
Okay, so you proceeded to help bring a lot of men out of the water. You
Yes.
started to treat those men where it was possible
Well,
to
I
help
tried.
them.
I just tried. My goal was to get them up out of the high water level, the high level point of the water that was coming in.
Would you proceed to give those men morphine and bandage them where you could? And
Yes. Well, these people that I was pulling out, I just left them. I pulled them up to as far as I could and left them there and went back into the next man. I pulled several people out of the water during that period until I became exhausted, and I took a little short rest, and then I proceeded to do it again. But you should not forget that I was, and this was also under heavy machine gun fire and rifle fire coming at you, and you have to remember that this was, I was working on in a confined area. This was going on all up and down the beach. So perhaps many people that, many men that drowned that could have been helped if help had come to them, but a lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them didn't make it. They were wounded. Perhaps they could have lived, but they were perhaps wounded so bad that they couldn't help themselves and they drowned. The water was red with blood from dead and wounded.
so as the morning progressed, did it become clear that German resistance was very fierce, that it was a lot of the men were stalled on the beaches and they were not able to clear pathways for themselves to get through the obstacles that were on the land? Is that true?
Yes. When we landed, when our landing craft hit these barriers that were up in the water, we had been blown off course. And when we made the beaches, we were not supposed to, we landed where we were not supposed to be. Many of the platoons and the men landed in the wrong places. And the particular place that we landed in, when we get up to the beach, there were two pillboxes right in front of us, and this was a situation that they wanted to avoid, but because we had because we had been blown off course, and we had no choice, we had to go ashore there. And once we got ashore, then of course, as I said before, the company commander was trying to motivate his men to move on, to get up off the beach and start moving inland. We had what they call Bangalore torpedo men. These were pipes that were filled with explosives, and they were shoved under the barbed wire to blow it up, to make a path, to get a path to go through, because barbed wire, if you get into the barbed wire, you would not be able to get out very easily, and you were doomed to die, because you had the Germans in front of you. They were just shooting while the machine gun fire and rifle fire and so forth, and mortars.
Mm-hmm. Were these two pillboxes on higher land? I believe the bluffs were, the backs of the beaches rose up as bluffs, maybe 40
Yes,
to 50 feet.
yeah.
Would that be true?
Yes, the pillboxes and the larger constructed pillboxes were on higher land, and they were. I've seen them after I have been back. I've seen them stood in them and looking down to the beach, and I just wondered how we made it.
Okay. Did the pillboxes, what ultimately happened to, as the morning went on, were those pillboxes knocked out by men that made it through the barbed wire?
There was a lot of courageous men that knocked out the pillboxes. Some was knocked out by the Navy, by ships that came very close that forced their ships up onto the beaches, the smaller ones,
Mm-hmm.
and took out pillboxes with their weapons, their artillery.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, many of the infantrymen took out pillboxes through their own
Mm-hmm.
courage by using flamethrowers and hand grenades and different types of machine guns and whatever they had.
How would you say that? When did you get a sense that the tide had turned, that things had stabilized on the beach, and that you felt you had a toehold, that you were going to make it? Was it in the morning, or was it?
It was about towards noon. Then took I think about 2 or 3 hours later. The men had already started moving off the beaches and were moving inland. Of course, there were so many wounded, I could not pay much attention to what was going on around me.
Mm-hmm.
I was only interested in treating the wounded, and I lost contact with the company that I had been assigned to, the platoon that I had been assigned to. I lost complete contact with them.
Mm-hmm.
I did not find them until the next day. And I know that later on in the day, I was able to walk up and down the beach looking for wounded and treating them.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across a fellow medic that I knew. I think he was assigned to E Company.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a stomach wound, a very serious stomach wound. And I knew that he was bleeding to death. He was dying. I knew that. So I bandaged him up as best I could. I gave him a shot of morphine.
Mm-hmm.
We said goodbye to each other.
Well, so as the morning went on, but as it moved into the afternoon, I assume many more troops and equipment started to
Mm-hmm.
come into the beaches,
Yeah.
and some of the enemy fire probably stopped as they knocked out pillboxes and machine
Mm-hmm.
gun nests, and the beach was stabilized. Maybe you can tell us over the next few days, in sort of a broad sense, what happened next. But when you were able to reunite with your company, and where you started to go after you got off the beach?
Well, I left the beach in the afternoon, early afternoon. I attached myself to men that had firstly come in from land and craft,
Mm-hmm.
and were moving inland.
Mm-hmm.
And I attached myself to them and moved in with them. Saw many dead American and German soldiers on the way, of course, and
Mm-hmm.
it became evening. I still had not found my unit, so I just bedded down in the field someplace and went to sleep.
Mm.
And the next morning I continued on, because I was like I would say, I was lost, you know. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know where my people were. I knew that I had to get to my company.
But you did find them the next day.
I found the next day. I found the battalion aid station. They had already set up a tent,
Mm-hmm.
and were in operation.
Mm-hmm.
And I reported in to them, and they of course were happy to see that I had made it.
Mm-hmm.
The people that had made it, and they sent me back to F Company, and I joined F Company. There was not much left of it when I joined them.
Okay. Well, I know that you were present for many of the subsequent battles across Europe,
Yes.
and we could probably potentially spend hours discussing that. So maybe we should raise our cameras up to somewhat of a higher level and tell me over the next few months, did you proceed across France? Were you in battles such as the Battle of the Falaise Pocket? Were you part of that? Were you part of the liberation of Paris? Did you ever get into Paris when it was liberated?
We went by on the outskirts of Paris. I myself went by with my people that I was assigned to. We went by Paris in trucks.
Okay.
Because the people that had pushed through us, because we were almost decimated. All the initial people that made the first wave, and they needed replacements, and it took a day or two to get replacements and to build the companies back up to strength.
Okay.
And the platoons, and the men that had pushed through us were advancing very fast, and of course, and we were moved up then to the front lines by trucks. I know that we bypassed Paris in trucks.
Okay.
And then we headed for Mons, Belgium, Liège. We took these two cities.
So you participated in the taking of those cities.
Yes.
On the Belgian side of the French-Belgian border, is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes, we went through the Siegfried Line, and we proceeded. The Siegfried Line went very close to Aachen, Germany. Aachen, Germany was the first one of the prize cities to be taken when we went into Germany, and they were defending it very fiercely because they didn't want to lose it.
Because it was the father.
And the 16th Regiment was assigned the mission to protect the eastern flank. Now, wait a minute, let's see, the western flank of the 26th Regiment. The 18th Regiment was assigned to protect the eastern flank, and the 26th Regiment went into the city.
Okay.
And there was house-to-house fighting, and it took them about a month before the Germans capitulated.
So would this still be 1944, or was it already early?
This was in 44. This was in September, October for 1944. I don't know the exact date.
Okay, so it was prior to the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh yes,
Would
yes.
that be
No, the
true?
Battle of the Bulge didn't come until it was winter already.
Till December.
Yeah.
So after participating in the taking of Aachen, where did you go from there?
From there,
Because if you were already in Germany, let me just comment. If you were already in Germany, then did you ever go back and spend more time in Belgium, or no?
well, we were, of course, we participated in major battles, and events. Sometimes we were pulled back to recuperate and rest and clean up a little bit into rest areas where we could take showers and so forth. And this was part of the process of moving in and out of battle. And I really don't know. As I said before, I was only a private, and I didn't know anything about the tactical maneuvering of the different units and what cities. I was not interested. We could not read road signs or anything, and I was not interested in knowing where I was because it didn't help me any.
Right.
I was only interested in doing my job.
Right. Well, that's understandable. Were you a participant in the Battle of the Bulge?
Yes.
The First
Yes,
Division
yes,
was.
we was, yes.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause right there. This is part 2 of the interview. It is late fall 1944, after the fall of the city of Aachen in Germany. And Charles, I'm going to ask you now to tell us about your participation in one of the greatest battles of the war, the largest battle in the history of the U.S. Army, the Battle of the Bulge. So please take it from there.
Well, I know that it was in deep winter when the Battle of the Bulge took place. There was a lot of snow, cold weather, ice, and I don't actually remember too much about it because I don't know why. But anyway, I recall that during this time, when we came to wooded areas, we used to take over installations that had been deserted by the Germans, some of their bunkers and foxholes, and they had very good, because they had time to build these things, they were very good.
Structures, basically.
They had structures, they had logs across the top of roofs, and they were fitted out with boughs from fir trees, and
Wow.
very comfortable for
Well,
that
it's
time.
nice that you didn't have to make them yourself, that they had made it for you.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that they deserved it to give it to you guys.
But it was still very cold, and we had a lot of frostbite because the men were not able to, their boots and feet, socks were getting wet, they were not able to change. And this is the reason, one of the reasons why frostbite, a lot of men had frostbite, because they were not able to keep their feet clean and change their socks. Mm-hmm. And so we had a lot of frostbite. The men had to be evacuated, of course, and we had a lot of wounded. I was continuously treating wounded people.
Well, the Battle of the Bulge came somewhat as a complete surprise.
Yes.
Is that true? That we were caught with our pants down. We didn't realize that the Germans had built up tremendous forces. And I guess we should just state in general that since the Americans had and the British, the Allies, had total control of the skies, and the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force, really was no longer a force to be reckoned with, that any significant offensive engagement that the Germans undertook had to be done during bad weather, when planes could not fly.
Right.
And the Battle of the Bulge started, I believe, on December 16th. So can you talk about just the surprise effect when it hit?
Well, I know that some of the Germans had infiltrated by donning American uniforms into the rear forces, and they took them by surprise because they thought they were Americans, and once they were in there, they started, of course, shooting down the GIs and so forth. And
isn't it true that a number of those Germans who, if caught, they were shot as spies?
I think they were shot as spies. Yes, they were immediately annihilated.
They were
killed.
executed. But one of the key things that they did was that they misdirected American soldiers. They confused roadways and sent people in. It just created mass confusion.
Yeah.
Okay, please go ahead.
Well, otherwise, I don't remember too much about. I think I seem to have pushed this out of my mind, and I can't make any positive comments about it because I just don't remember. Mm-hmm. And I prefer not to answer questions that I cannot answer with honesty.
But you did indeed.
But I experienced. I was. Everybody knows that the 1st Infantry, the 16th Regiment, participated in the Battle of the Bulge.
Okay.
That's all I can say.
Okay. Well, after the Battle of the Bulge, did you continue to push into Germany and move ever forward? Is that basically what you recall?
Yes. Yeah. We reached after we left after the Battle of the Bulge, and so then we continued more or less southwest, and there was only one bridge that was left over the Rhine, and that was at Remagen. Mm-hmm. And I think this bridge was taken by I think it was taken by the 3rd, I think they called it the 3rd Tank Division or 3rd Armored Division, I think. They captured that bridge intact. Right. But the Germans, they were shelling it with long-range shelling from the Netherlands. I think this is correct now. Although they never made a direct hit on the bridge, the concussion of these high explosives that they were placing into the area caused the bridge to collapse, because on both sides of the river were massive stone mountains, and the base of the bridges, the abutments of the bridges were located on each side of the river, located on these stone. Well, I don't know, ledges or whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
And the concussion is what took the bridge down.
But I believe that there were three major groups of American forces. I think the 1st, the 5th, and the 7th divisions that were each looking for a way to cross the Rhine. Yeah. And the bridge that you talk about was,
that was a railroad bridge, I think. If
that's
I'm
correct. It was a railroad
Yeah.
bridge that the Germans had reconfigured so that vehicles could get across it, and the American troops that approached that bridge were able to get there a little more quickly than they thought, and they sort of surprised the Germans and rushed across, and that was the first group of American troops to cross. I know I shouldn't be much of a historian myself, but I know that Patton was very much hoping that his forces would be first across, which they were not, but that when he did cross, he made quite a showing of going across a pontoon bridge over the Rhine in full view of all of his troops, and proceeding to stop halfway across the bridge and urinate into the Rhine to the great glee of all of his troops. That was Patton for you. Okay, so once you're in Germany, you've crossed the Rhine, and it's probably now getting further into the winter, maybe toward the end of the winter. Is that fair?
Yes, it was already getting February, March.
Okay.
And I crossed the Rhine on that pontoon bridge that you were talking about now. We crossed the Rhine in trucks on the pontoon bridge.
Okay.
And then we proceeded northeast from there. And we came up into Hannif. We came up to the Sieg River, one city by the name of Hannif, and a couple of other small villages on the Sieg River. And the Sieg was in a valley on the one side, where high mountainous, not really mountains, but very high mountainous area.
Terrain, yes.
And the other side of the Rhine was relatively level.
Okay.
And I was selected, I don't know why, they sent out a reconnaissance squad to go across the Sieg River. There was still a railroad bridge across this river that was intact. And I was attached to this squad. Normally, they do not attach medics to reconnaissance squads. And but I was attached to the squad, and we proceeded across this bridge, across the Sieg River, and they would.
At least this way we have a good way of measuring how much time has gone by in the interview.
And there were Germans in this little village on the other side of the Sieg River. And I knew that, I mean, in my mind, I knew myself that they could see us because we were out in the open. And they could have taken us out on the bridge if they wanted to, because they were a small group of infantry, maybe a squad or so, or maybe a little bit more. And they were backed up by a Tiger tank with an 88mm weapon on it. And if they wanted to, they could have blown us out into hell with that weapon. But they let us come. And we got into the village, and of course they were waiting for us. And they knew we were coming. And the squad leader, we came around the house. I was in the back because I was the medic. I was the last man in the group. He came around the corner of a house and staring at a Tiger tank with an 88mm weapon on it, and a squad or two of infantrymen. And the infantrymen were, at that time, Hitler was grabbing at the bottom of the barrel to replace men that he had lost, and he was taking 15 or 16-year-olds into the Army.
Mm-hmm.
They were receiving very little training, if they received any at all.
Mm-hmm.
They probably just placed a rifle in their hand, and they were infantrymen. And my main concern was when I saw that, I was afraid that they were going to open fire on us because they were so young. But fortunately, they were under the command of officers that perhaps they were older, of course, and
More
they
seasoned
had
officers.
experience, so they did not fire upon us.
So they accepted your surrender because you were hopelessly outnumbered.
Well, we were outnumbered, but when you're staring down the barrel of an 88mm weapon, you just automatically, it's either drop your weapon or be blown into hell.
Right.
So
Understood.
I had nothing to do with it because that was the squad leader's decision,
Mm-hmm.
and he decided to surrender.
Okay.
And we were taken immediately captive, and we were disarmed, and they even took away my medical equipment and everything,
Really?
and our helmets and my Red Cross armband.
They didn't even let you keep that?
Didn't even let me keep that, no.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were doing this, the Americans, they started shelling, but it was only 2 or 3 or 4 shells that came in. We took cover, of course. Some of them came very close, and we took cover. But then it stopped. So evidently, they must have received words that there were Americans there also now, and I presume, I don't know, but I presume, and because the shelling, after 2 or 3 shells, it stopped. So it can only be that they knew that Americans were there, so they stopped shelling. And we were stripped down of everything. The only thing we had on were our shoes and our clothes. And we were immediately given a couple of guards, and we immediately moved out of the area, front line area, and moved into the back, behind the German lines.
Were you then transported by train or truck or something?
No. We only moved by night. Always walking because the Americans had air control, and we could not move by day.
Because you could have been strafed and killed.
Yeah, we could not move by day. We only moved by night, and the days they were trying to hide someplace. And we did this. We figured out that I must have walked 50 or 60 miles to the rear areas and to the Stalag 6G, where I eventually wound up. And along the way, we kept getting more and more American prisoners joining us. And they moved us back to this camp, Stalag 6G.
And this was in March of 1945, I
This was in March of 1945. I got captured on the 25th of March when I left across the Sieg River.
Okay.
And on that same day, the First Army started its offensive that eventually ended the war.
Okay.
And we were dropped off in this Stalag 6G, and we were given food and drink, of course. Our food consisted of pea soup and a ration of bread, and that was a day's ration. Every day we got the same thing.
Probably the Germans were even having trouble feeding their own troops.
Yeah, they didn't have any food themselves because they could not receive any supplies or anything anymore.
Right.
And one morning we woke up and there were no more Germans in the camp. They were gone. They had taken off. So.
And then American
And
soldiers
then Americans shortly thereafter, just matter of a couple of hours, the Americans came.
Were they just infantrymen or some tanks?
Infantry. I think it was if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the 45th Infantry Division, but I'm not sure about that either.
Did they bring you food and just?
No, they didn't. they checked the camp out and they saw that there were no Germans there, and but they had intense, fierce fighting was still going on, and they continued. They came to us on approximately the 12th of April, but because there was fierce fighting going on, we could not leave the camp. We could not leave the area. We had to stay put, and it eventually became they had done away with the resistance in the area, and eventually on the 18th of April, 6 days later, no, 4 days later, they came back and we were in American hands again.
Repatriated.
Repatriated, yeah. And
where were you taken at that point? Were you taken to some rear area behind the American
yeah,
lines?
we were taken out to a rear area behind the American lines, and we were given food and allowed to clean up and given change clothing, fresh clothing, allowed to clean up. And then I eventually found my way through the system that they had established for handling POWs, Americans that had been retaken. We eventually wound up in France at the port of, I don't know if it was Le Havre or someplace up there anyway, and we boarded ships and sailed back to USA.
I know that there was a point system that was used to determine how quickly, when the war was over, how quickly troops were eligible to go home.
Yeah.
And I believe that under normal circumstances you had to accumulate a little over 80 points for various factors. It could be everything from, I guess, if you were the head of a family, it could have to do with the length of service and a number of other factors. But because you were a POW, you were probably perhaps given
pretty close to the top of the list.
Top of the list.
Yeah.
So you boarded a ship on the French coast and you headed directly to Boston?
Yeah, and this particular ship landed in Boston, which was very fortunate for me because that's where I wanted to go.
And your parents were there?
No, they were not there, no. They did not know that I was coming home.
Okay.
They received a telegram at the very beginning, shortly after I was captured. I was captured on the 25th of March, and I think they did not receive a written notification, I think, to the beginning of April.
That you had been taken prisoner?
That I was missing in action. They didn't know if I had been taken prisoner. I mean, they didn't state it in the letter.
Do you happen to have that telegram?
I have it, yes.
Oh, that's...
And this was followed up by a letter. And in the letter that they sent, they said if we do not hear any more in 3 months, if we hear anything within the next 3 months, we'll notify you immediately. But of course, I was already on the ship on my way back to the States. My parents did not know this.
Where were your parents then?
They were in Boston.
Okay,
yeah.
But they had no idea that you were shipping back?
They had no idea that I was on my way back.
So you then arrived in Boston?
Yeah, and I arrived in Boston, and I told the people that were in charge of me that I was from Boston, and if I could go home to my parents. And once I was processed through, I was told I was permitted to leave and go to my to my parents' home in Boston. Of course, I was told when and where to report next. I was given leave, told when and where to report once my leave was up. And I went home to my parents. They were living in Charlestown, Massachusetts, on Monument Square.
Did they know you were coming? Or they
No,
had
they had no idea. They had no idea about what had happened to me. They only from the correspondence that they had received a few weeks earlier.
So you went home they were completely surprised.
Yeah, I went home and I knocked on the door, and my mother opened the door, and it was a complete surprise for her. Yeah.
She must have almost fallen over.
Almost fell over, I think, yeah.
Well, that's a very happy ending to your experience. That's fantastic. Well, let me then pause in the chronology and let's just talk briefly. I just want to circle back and ask you a couple of questions. First of all, for your services during the war, you did receive the Silver Star. That is
Yes.
correct.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yes.
is for your actions on June 6th
Right.
on the beaches at
Mm-hmm.
Omaha.
Yeah.
Okay. When you were taken prisoner, did you feel that under the circumstances, the Germans treated you fairly well, or any comments on that? Your
No, I
interactions?
can't. I was not treated. Of course, the Germans themselves, they had nothing to eat. We didn't get. We got enough to eat to survive, but we were not overfed.
Mm-hmm.
We had to eat what the Germans were eating, and that was peach soup and bread.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot complain about the treatment because I thought I was treated under the conditions that I was living. I felt that I was being treated humanely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When we know that you were awarded the Silver Star, when were you actually presented with that? Was there a ceremony sometime
There
during
was
the
a
war?
ceremony a couple of weeks later, after. It was not very long after, because I know that one of the men that was decorated with me had received the Distinguished Service Cross
Mm-hmm.
for something that he did. He had his helmet. He had a bullet hole right through the middle of his helmet, and I guess when it went into his helmet, it just circled around. He was not injured by where the bullet went in. He was not injured by that bullet.
Wow.
And he continued on and did some courageous act, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross.
Which is the second below the Medal of Honor. It's
Yeah,
the highest medal.
yeah, the second highest honor. And we were pinned by some general, but I don't know who it was anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you sort of a few basic questions. Did you stay in touch with your family during the war? Were you able to exchange letters and?
Oh yes, that we exchanged letters. Yes, I wrote frequent. That was the only mode of communication in those days, was mail.
Okay, and you know your letters were censored, but at least you were able
Yeah,
to send letters
and you had
out.
to be careful what you wrote because all the letters were censored.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they might arrive to your parents, and half the letter would be lined out with black ink.
Do you still have any of the letters?
No, I have nothing like that.
Oh,
No.
that would be nice to have. Was the food good when you were in the service? Do you think you had good supplies most of the time, and you were fed well when you were in the Army, or?
In the military, oh yes, I liked the military service. I came back after I left. After I got back to Boston, I was sent up to Lake Placid, New York, for rest and recuperation.
Mm-hmm.
I think for about a month. And once I left there, I was sent down to. I wound up in Fort Story, Virginia, working in the hospital as a surgical technician.
Mm-hmm.
And in October, I was discharged from there.
Okay. Let me ask you a few other questions about the time of the service. I know that you've said before that you relied on your mother's prayers and teachings that your mother that gave you great strength. Did you carry anything for good luck?
No, I only carried my mother's prayers in my mind, and I have been through 2 wars. I went through the Korean War also as a combat medic, and I went through 2 wars, and I was never wounded once.
Well, you're very, very fortunate. Can you remember what did men do for entertainment when they weren't actually in battle and they were recuperating behind the lines? You mentioned that they gambled a lot, played cards.
Yeah, mostly. I remember mostly gambling. We used to play poker or shoot dice or whatever,
Okay.
but that was our entertainment. And then, of course, if you were in a rest area, they had USO shows going on for the troops.
Did you ever see any of those?
I saw a couple, yes, and
Can you remember any of the entertainers?
no, I don't remember any of the participants. No.
Okay. Can you remember, even in war, as much as war is hell, there at times can be humorous incidents that occur. Can you remember anything that was something that's particularly funny that you can remember from your experiences that you could share with us?
Particularly funny?
Or just something humorous, maybe a prank that soldiers played on each other, or just something unusual that may have stood out in
Yeah.
contrast to the horror of battle?
No, not in combat, no. I had one particular incident which I will not discuss when I was in England, but
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we know that you have a number of photographs, and we're going to eventually include copies of those with this interview. Did you have a great degree of respect for your officers that you served under and for your fellow soldiers?
oh yes, I know.
You felt you were part of a good group of men.
Oh yes, that was a wonderful experience with the brotherhood. You know, we all knew what we were going through, and I tried not to make very close friends with anybody. I stayed alone for myself. I had one incident where I had become close friends with an older man, and we used to call him, because he was older, he had the nickname Pop. I don't even know what his real name was. And while we were in the Hurtgen forest, he was dug in, and we were being shelled very heavily. And a lot of the shells were hitting in the treetops and exploding. And where he was laying, one hitting the treetop and showered shrapnel down on him. And he was mortally wounded. He had also a very bad stomach wound, tore his stomach out and everything, and there was no help for him. And I was at the command post with the platoon leader and the first sergeant, and I heard him calling, so I went out to try to help him. And when I saw him, I knew there was no help for him, and I broke down emotionally. Then, when I returned back to the CP, and once we were able to, once the battle for the Hurtgen Forest had stopped, I was sent back for recuperation, not back, but just back to the battalion aid station for a few days.
Because you were emotionally drained and exhausted.
I was emotionally, hurt when I saw him. And then I eventually returned to F Company.
Okay. All right. So you told me that you were discharged in October of 1945, and at that time you were in Virginia?
I was discharged in Fort Story, Virginia.
Okay.
From Fort Story, Virginia. I was working in a hospital there.
And then once you were discharged, you initially came back home to Maine, is that correct?
I went back to Boston. My parents were still living in Boston.
Okay.
They were still working in the Navy Yard. And after being home for a week or two, I started looking for a job, and I eventually found a job with Sears and Roebuck in a catalog mailing department, filling orders. But I couldn't find any satisfaction doing that, and I eventually left, and I went back up to Maine. And when I got back up here to the reservation, I saw that the situation had not changed since the time I left in 1943 to go into the military service. The situation was exactly the same. Alcohol was a problem. There was no work for the young people. No jobs were available. And I just did not want to live like that, so I had found security in the military service, so that's why I decided to go back.
So you re-enlisted when, approximately?
I re-enlisted. I was discharged in October, and I re-enlisted in April again.
So it was only about a 6-month break.
Yeah, I re-enlisted in April of 1946.
Okay. We talked before about friendships that you made in the service, and I believe it's true that you continued some friendships, but they were with, I know, some other Native Americans that you knew before the war, or that you knew, or like Melvin Neptune,
Yes,
you remained friends with him.
Yeah.
Were there others from your days in the service that you remained, from World War II, that you kept friendships with? You mentioned someone who you're still in touch with.
Yeah, there was a certain the staff sergeant that I told you, I think I told you that I reported to a staff sergeant when I joined the organization. Staff Sergeant Lambert was his name.
Yes.
And of course, I never heard any more from him because he was wounded on Omaha Beach, and I never saw him again.
Mm-hmm.
I only knew him for a short time, so that meant I knew him from November
43.
until November 43 until June
Right.
6th of 44.
Right.
And he was wounded on Omaha Beach, and he never came back.
Okay.
And then I, of course, I continued my career in the military service. He did not stay in the military service.
Mm-hmm.
I continued my military service, my career in the military service, and I was discharged. I retired. Well, I was discharged actually from the Army in 1952 because when I came back from Korea, they wanted to send me to another infantry division, and I said, no, that's it. I said, my enlistment is up in July of 52, and I said, I want to get out. I'm getting out.
But whereas you did get out of the Army after
I got out of
Korea,
the Army, yes.
you shortly after that went in with the same rank, went into the Air Force
I signed
Reserve.
up in the Air Force Reserve with the same rank and everything. And I had saved a little bit of money, and my wife and I went to Europe, back to Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to get a job there, and I couldn't find any work, so I finally went broke, and I had to come back home to the United States. And I came back and left my wife there
Mm-hmm.
in Vienna. I came back and requested recall to active duty in the Air Force, and they took me back.
Mm-hmm.
And after I had gotten settled a few months later, my wife joined me
Joined you here.
here in the United States, yes.
Okay. And now it should be said, by the way, we should back up and say that when you had re-enlisted in April of 1946, you went back as part of the military government apparatus to Austria.
Yeah, first I went back to Germany, Regensburg,
Mm-hmm.
where the 1st Infantry Division headquarters was stationed, I think. I went back to the 1st Infantry Division, and but I was not working in the job that I was trained to do. I was doing some odd jobs and working in the housing authority and things like this, and warehouses. And orders came down to send me down to Vienna, Austria. And I had never heard of Vienna, and I didn't even know where Vienna was. That was the first time I ever heard of it. And yeah, well, I went down there, and I landed in December, shortly before Christmas. I was in Vienna.
December 1946?
December 1946, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you'd been back in the service only for several months.
Yeah, I was only back, a few months. I re-enlisted
April 46.
April 46, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So after you'd been in Austria, how quickly after that did you meet your wife, by the way?
How
What
soon
year
did I
it
meet
was?
her? I think I met her in the winter of 47.
Okay. And we already know that you went to a dance with two other soldiers,
Yeah.
and there were three of you men and only two women, so the
Yeah.
men had a discussion in the men's room about odd
Yeah.
man out, and
Yeah.
luckily you were not the odd man out, and the rest is happy history.
Yeah.
Okay, so when your wife and you were, when you were in the Air Force Reserve in the United States in the early 1950s, you eventually ended up back in Austria in the Air Force Reserve until 1964, is that correct?
No, I didn't. After I joined the Air Force, I was. I worked in the hospital I worked in on Long Island. I forget the name of the air base now that was there. And then I was eventually sent to the hospital in Springfield, Massachusetts. I don't know what the name of that air base is anymore. And then I eventually wound up in Orlando, Florida. And then I was sent from there to Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma, where I joined a weather squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular weather squadron had already been assigned to participate in Operation Castle, which was a atomic bomb test that was taking place in the Marshall Islands at Eniwetok.
And this would be the middle 1950s?
That was in 1954.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went into the Pacific and participated
I went to the Pacific, Marshall Islands, Caroline Islands. I was in the Carolinas, Marshall Islands.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I stayed there, I think, approximately 6 months I was there.
And then you came back to the
And I
United
came
States.
back to the States, but my wife was waiting for me here still
Okay.
when I came back.
And then shortly after that, did you eventually go back to Austria
Yeah,
or to Europe?
I came back, and then I went, I wound up in Virginia in a Air Reserve unit outside of Richmond at the air base there, at the flying field, the field of the civilian flying field. They had a small reserve unit flying planes out of there.
Mm-hmm.
I joined them, and while I was there, I was able to go quite often to the Pentagon, and I used to go up there with my wife, and I was looking for an assignment to Europe again.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very fortunate that I got one of the choice assignments in Europe by being persistent and going back and forth to Pentagon. I wound up in the major hospital that was stationed in Wiesbaden. I think it was the one of, I don't know what the number was anyway, Station Hospital
Mm-hmm.
in Wiesbaden. Hmm.
Okay.
And I stayed there for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a choice assignment.
So at that point, it was probably the late 1950s.
Yeah, it was late 1950s, and then from there I went to, let's see, oh yeah, I went from Wiesbaden, I went back to Colorado Springs.
Okay, so you came back to the United States.
Yeah, I came back to the United States. My wife and I, we had our son with us then. We came back, and I went to Colorado Springs. I was in Colorado Springs for a year. Cannon Air Force Base was the name of the base in Colorado Springs.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there for a year. And then I began bothering the people in the personnel department there for an assignment to Europe again, and I got one. I came back and joined the 38th Missile Squadron, which was stationed in Sembach, Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was getting very close to my retirement.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as I had my 20 years in, I put in for retirement,
Mm-hmm.
and it was accepted.
And this was 1964.
That was 1964, and I was went into retirement, I think, on the 31st of July
Mm-hmm.
of 64. I went into retirement, and my wife and I, we packed everything up and we moved to Vienna.
Okay.
And I was hoping that I could find employment there, something to do, but I still had money because I had my retirement paid by that time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to worry too much.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, I found out that there was a UN organization. The International Atomic Energy Agency had its headquarters in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
And I applied for employment there. And at the beginning, I was not successful. I went to a personnel department for an interview, and I was interviewed by a German woman that was in charge of a personnel department.
Mm-hmm.
And she advised me to go to see the United States representative that was in Vienna,
Mm-hmm.
assigned to the Atomic Energy Agency. So I made an appointment with him, and at the U.S. Embassy, and went and had a talk with him. And he was a war veteran also from the Second World War. I think he had one arm missing or something. And when I talked with him, well, I knew I would have a job in the next. And sure enough, 2 or 3 weeks later, I was called in for my final interview because he had intervened for me, and I had a job.
So you spent 20 years with
I spent 20 years with the International Atomic Energy Agency and retired 1984.
Okay.
Retired from there, and I was out only about 6 months, and I got a call from the personnel officer of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and he told me that they were looking for a security officer for the High Commissioner for Refugee, the Vienna office. They were looking for a security officer, and they wanted somebody that could speak perfect German and perfect English. So I went and I applied, and I was accepted, and I worked an additional 2.5 years for the High Commissioner's Vienna office as a security officer.
Okay. So that basically, at that point, your formal working years were over.
My formal working years were over. I was already over 60. I was going on 63 or 64. But I still had, during this time that I was working for the High Commissioner for Refugees, my son came to Vienna on leave one time from the United States. He was living in the United States by that time.
And he was in the service himself.
He was in the service, yeah, and he had gotten out of the service by that time when he came.
What branch of the service was he in?
He was in the Air Force also.
Okay.
Yeah, and he was looking for a job in Vienna. So we looked into the newspapers and we found a limousine service that was looking for drivers that could speak English. So I took him. We went there and talked with it was Kerry International Limousine Service, and he had a concession to open up an office in Vienna, and he took my son on immediately, and then he turned to me and asked me if I would like to work. So I said, well, I can work for you, but only on holidays and weekends because I have a job. So we did that.
So you also, while you were working as a security man, that you told us about before, you also did some chauffeuring work.
I was doing chauffeuring. I was a guide and chauffeur for that Kerry International Limousine Service.
Okay.
For weekends and holidays.
So you eventually, just to sum up before I ask you a couple of final questions, you continued to live with your wife in Vienna.
Yes.
Except for occasional visits during the summertime to the United States to work on some property here in Maine that was on the reservation, to restore the property. You continued to live in Germany until the year 2000.
In Austria.
In Austria, my apologies, in Austria, until the year 2003.
Yes, in 2002 we made the decision to make the final move back to the United States, and we moved all of our furniture back, and we planned our final move for the spring of 2003 to move back to the Indian Reservation and stay here.
Okay. Well, that brings us roughly to the present. So, your wife has now passed away. She did have an opportunity to return to your native homeland with you.
Yes.
And which was a very fitting and wonderful event. Let me ask you a couple of final questions, Charles. Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, yeah, especially since we have been involved with Iraq and Afghanistan. I have to say that I totally disagree the way that this has been handled. From the highest level, not from the officers and so forth, because they only have to follow orders. But I think it has been, this is my opinion. I don't want to get in arguments with anybody. This is the way I think.
Okay. Well, although I don't believe you have been, are you in any veterans organizations now? You belong to the Association for the First Division, is that correct?
Yes, I belong to the Association for the First Division. I'm a lifetime member of the First Division Association. I'm a lifetime member of the 16th Infantry Regiment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lifetime member of the VFW 3381 in Old Town, Maine. And I am an annual member of the American Legion in Old Town.
Okay. And I would like to backtrack for a moment and indicate that you were, because of your services during World War II and helping, being part of the liberation of France, but also because of your bloodline, which goes back not only as a Native American, but has since the 17th century has been intertwined with French nobility.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You were honored by French President Sarkozy in Washington, D.C., I believe in 2007.
Yes, November 2007.
And he presented you with a very prestigious award. And please tell me the name of that award again.
That's the French Legion of Honor.
The French Legion of Honor, which you received personally from President Sarkozy.
But I was not alone at that time. I was inducted with there were 7 of us that were inducted at the same time.
Which included Senator Daniel Inouye.
Yes, exactly. And we were invited to Washington, D.C., to the ambassador's residence. Mm-hmm. And because it was being held in Washington, D.C., the representative of that was sitting in Boston, the general counsel in Boston, the Boston office, came to my home and escorted me personally to Washington, D.C.
It's a tremendous honor, which adds to an extraordinary personal history. So, have you attended reunions in the past? You do intend to attend some reunions this year. That is correct?
Yes, I'm going to the 1st Infantry Division reunion, which will be held on the 24th to the 28th of August. And then I will be going to the 29th Infantry Division reunion, which will be held in, I think, around the 20th of October. I don't know the exact date.
Now, although you were not in the 29th
Not
division,
in the 29th, but I have become acquainted with members of the 29th Infantry Division, with several veterans, mm-hmm. and they have invited me and asked me to attend their reunion.
That's a tremendous honor.
And I accepted.
You've all served at that landing on June 6,
mm-hmm.
1944.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. In summing up, Charles, I'll ask 2 questions. How did your service and wartime experiences affect your life? And is there anything you would like to add that we have not covered in the interview so far? Any closing statements you'd like to make? But please tell us how those experiences changed you as a man and affected your life.
Well, I think this was my destiny. I feel like my life was how do I want to say that? I think that my life was planned. I can't find the word now that I want. I think I was programmed for my life to go the way it has gone, because so many good things have happened to me, and so many bad things, but most of the things that happened to me have been always good and positive. Mm-hmm. I think I've had a very effective and a very, just a very good life. I've experienced a lot. I've been all over the world. I've had a beautiful wife. I have a very intelligent son.
And a wonderful grandson.
Yeah, and I have a wonderful grandson. And, I can only say that only good things have happened to me since my life began in 1924.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you very much for this interview. It's a welcome and valuable addition to the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project. So once again, we thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.